In a well-travelled world, and it is very much a well-travelled world these days, tourists are often looking for something different when they go away. It's seen the rise of what's known as voluntourism, volunteering while on vacation, which makes everybody feel good, right? Or is it taking advantage, perhaps, of the volunteers and the people they are supposed to be helping? Very good to have you with us. I'm David Foster. This is Roundtable. So, you've booked a voluntourism trip, but have you done your research? Do you know what your money's paying for, who it's going to, and if you perhaps have the ability to make a positive difference, or in fact the opposite?
It's feel-good tourism. The idea that if you volunteer your time towards a worthy cause, it will enhance your travel experience abroad. But is so-called voluntourism actually beneficial to communities in need? Or is it doing more harm than good? Every year, millions of people from wealthier nations travel to the developing world to take part in voluntourism. Its popularity is rising amongst gap year students and companies building team unity, a holiday that's good for your conscience.
No, I'm a city suited and booted advertising chick. This is about as far removed as you get, but it feels a lot better to be doing this than doing that.
But while it looks great on the surface, there are questions over how helpful it actually is. Travellers taking part often have to pay to be part of a volunteer group, and critics say it's turning what would be an act of kindness into a business exchange. Children's orphanages, which have all but gone from the Western world, are propped up by money generated from volunteers. Building projects too, it's been argued, are expensive and take work away from skilled locals. Concerns have also been raised over the legitimacy of some organisations in an industry that is yet to be regulated. Supporters say voluntourism has opened an enriching form of travel to the masses, which simultaneously creates a global awareness for worthy causes and a sense of community philanthropy. But does it focus too much on the visitor experience rather than the community in need? Those entering into voluntourism do so with a sense of personal growth and change. But is their good intention misguided? Is voluntourism creating a false kind of charity?
And we are on our very own trip around the world on this programme. Joining us via Skype from Kampala in Uganda, first of all, Teddy Ruge, social change advocate and entrepreneur. We then move on to Barcelona. Shannon O'Donnell is there. Shannon O'Donnell, traveller, writer and speaker. And with me at the round table, we have Tom Dallison, Head of Science at the Coral Key Conservation, and Georgette Mulheir, Chief Executive of Lumos, which is an international NGO working to end the institutionalisation of children. Aren't we being a bit ungrateful? These people are putting themselves out to do something and they want to help.
I think ungrateful is the wrong word. So whilst most volunteers who go abroad do so with the very best of intentions, we know that hundreds of millions, possibly billions of dollars a year are poured into the voluntourism industry for people to go and volunteer in orphanages. Around the world, there are at least 8 million children in orphanages. 80% of them have living parents. Most of them are there simply because of poverty. And there's 80 years of evidence that shows it's severely harmful to put a child in an orphanage and raise them in that way outside of family, which is why we don't do it in developed countries anymore. And so what has happened over the last decade or so is the desire to volunteer in orphanages has actually driven the development of orphanages and has probably driven millions of children into them who would otherwise have been in their families.
So your problem is not with voluntourism as such, but with orphanages and voluntourism. All other sorts are okay? I'm
not an expert on all other sorts. I think that what I can say is that certainly in terms of orphanage volunteering, people have not done enough research and they're not seeing how their activities are actually driving the trafficking of children.
Teddy, let me move to you in Kampala in Uganda. You believe, I think, that it is actually also depriving local people that young, middle-aged, middle class, mostly relatively well-off people come and do what they think is a good thing, that it's actually damaging local communities as well as the area that Georgette's just talked about?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, if you think about just the demographics of the continent of Africa alone, we have about 50% of the continent is under the age of 15. And what you're doing in that instance in the volunteerism is you're disenfranchising and removing opportunities from young people to actually be experts in their own field. You're eroding their agency and their ability to actually also build up talent to solve some of the very intractable problems that they could contribute to solving. Why are we having gap year kids come and build schools for us when we have engineers locally? Why are we having gap year kids come and volunteer at orphanages when we have community centers and community families that could actually take care of them? Why are we having them come in to literally, you know, if you look behind you is that picture of a white volunteer with a bunch of orphanage kids. Those kids are being taught that that person in front of them that has come thousands of miles away is the one responsible for fixing any problems in their communities.
But let me stop you there. Let me stop you there, because you're painting a picture of somebody who comes in and does more harm than good. But if that person, yes, the one who's over my shoulder, unnamed, unknown to me, but if that person didn't go, where would the money come from to make sure that those people or those other people were perhaps in a better condition than they were before?
I think that's looking at it the wrong way. The assumption is that just because they're actually bringing in money. Sometimes they're actually really not. Sometimes it's just not simply about having the money. Sometimes the expertise in the long run is better to keep that in the community than constantly reminding communities to forego their responsibility of developing their own areas of where they're living and sitting around and waiting for other people to. So
are you sort of suggesting that it's a bit like in the animal world, where, you know, young birds, they either fly or they don't fly, that you have to kick somebody out of the nest to make sure that they can survive?
Absolutely. At some point, you have to take off the, you know, the riding gear and let people actually learn by failure. You know, like you said, that bird has to get out of that nest and actually learn to fly by themselves. The mom is not going to do it for them.
Okay, Shannon, you're writing about this. You have a blog. You were a voluntourist, if you want. What lessons did you learn, and what are you trying to teach other people, not just individuals, but organisations? What are you telling them about the pitfalls?
So fundamentally, I think underpinning both what we're talking about in each of these industries, orphanage volunteering, having people come and paint schools, is it's a lack of understanding between what's actually needed on the part of the voluntourists and what's needed in these communities. And at fault there is the marketing. These multinational companies, these volunteer companies are selling something that isn't actually what's needed. So if you have skilled volunteers going to these communities, I don't think that's in any way, right? You have a social worker who's going and spending a year at an orphanage to help implement some of these change. That's very different than a gap year student. And so I'm really big on telling volunteers, it's not about saying your intentions are all wrong, but there's a better way that we could be doing it. And
what is that better way?
Well, it's re-educating. It's saying, like, maybe, because to your point is this money, there is money coming into these communities, but when it's through a multinational, you know, volunteer company, that money then leaves the community. It's staying in the United Kingdom or the United States with the company that organized the volunteer project. And so volunteers who want to be of service have to understand they're not a part of this volunteer industry. They're a part of the international aid and development, and there are standards there, and you can better educate and instead look at how a different style of travel might be a better fit for your trip. You want to do really good work in Uganda or Rwanda? Maybe don't volunteer. Maybe go and spend your money locally, infuse that money in the local economy, and empower those locals to address their own social issues.
Teddy, we will come back to you in just a moment, but I want to introduce Tom into the conversation. And Shannon, I will come back to you and ask you another question. You can ponder this one while we're away, which is, does it not do some good for the people like the person behind me, that they come back from this perhaps better people and therefore more able to help society? But that's a different question. when it comes to animals, which is where you come in on this one, Tom, how come people can be doing harm when they're not actually in the water? They are just helping people like you.
Sure. So I think we need to look at this in sort of the bigger picture in terms of conservation, if you will. Yes, there is a large element, you know, particularly for us, it's diving, you know, conserving coral reefs, but then you also have the local capacity and the local stakeholder element to that as well. It's not as simple as taking some volunteers, taking them diving, collecting some data, and then, you know, and then they leave. You have to integrate the local community into your interactions, unless conservation doesn't become successful. So I can relate to some of the things that the other guests are saying in that sense, but you have to place it into our concept of conservation.
How is it happening at the moment? Because sitting here in London, at almost the beginning of November, I can't imagine volunteering to put on a scuba pack and go down and look at a coral reef. So how does it work?
So currently we're active in the Philippines, and if I use that as this sort of example model, in a sense of a volunteer will come to the Philippines with us, they will on a residency, whether it's
they will have paid for this?
They would have paid for that, yeah. So they pay for their flights, but also the services and the diving and the food and accommodation.
All sounds great. Where's the money going to?
So then the money goes back into the organisation, into the project.
Can't see a problem so far?
So we look at, yes, we have the data collection side of things, but we also run various other community projects as well. So we have a very large education side of things. So we go into schools, we teach local children, those local stakeholders.
Tick, tick, tick. I'm liking
we
everything
integrate that
here
environmental
so
concept. We also have a scholarship programme where
where does it go wrong?
So I think it goes wrong where you get those stories of where that money isn't being interjected into the community, where you have those experiences where the data is collected and then it's brought out of the country and it's put into the scientific bubble, should we say, where with institutions there is a drive to write scientific papers, and that is the drive for it, and then the local community are sort of forgotten in that sense.
Okay.
So that's when it can go wrong, and then it seems as though the volunteers, their efforts, isn't being relayed back to that community, and it's not becoming beneficial.
Teddy, I know you wanted to say something, but it seems to me that what I'm hearing so far is that the volunteers themselves may have the best intentions, but they could find out more, as Shannon says, about the harm it might be doing. But also they're perhaps being ripped off by institutions that are diverting their money away from what they believed it was being invested in. Now, that's a point I'm just putting out there as a rhetorical question, but you wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I did want to add and say there's nothing wrong with foreign people being in our communities. Come, spend your money in our communities. Come and engage with our communities. Be equals in our communities. However, the thing that we're not mentioning is that there is a top-down-ism to kind of this arrangement to volunteerism, whereas white members of the foreign community who are coming in to our communities to help with problem XYZ are reinforcing this notion that it's someone else's responsibility to come and fix. However much money you're bringing in, it's balanced, it's canceled out by this continuation of this assumption that it's someone else's responsibility to come and fix the issues in our community. That's what I have a contention with. The very presence of a Western individual in our community doing something to fix something that is perceivably impracticable in our community reinforces the idea that it's someone else's responsibility to fix it for us.
Okay, Teddy, but we go back to the old analogy of kicking the bird out of the nest. Sometimes they don't fly, sometimes they do hit the ground, and therefore children could perhaps be disadvantaged if you withdraw some of the support that they're getting. Georgette, so how can you rework it? You did so in Romania.
Yes, and in many countries, and in Sudan.
Rwanda's now being held up as a wonderful example.
That's right. And the reason those countries are transforming their systems is because it's their own governments and communities who are taking responsibility for that. They do receive perhaps some international money to help in the initial stages, and they do perhaps receive some international expertise, but it's local leadership that makes the change. The example I wanted to give you was Haiti, because in Haiti there are 30,000 children in orphanages. Most people think that's because of the earthquake, but actually most of those children have been trafficked into those orphanages just to provide a volunteering experience for the many volunteers who want to come down.
Hang on, they are being bought by somebody so that voluntourists will go in and say, we can help these people who could be helped properly in another way.
That's absolutely right. More than 80%.
That's criminal, isn't it?
It is criminal. More than 80% of the orphanages in Haiti are operating outside the law. They pay people called child finders who go out and aggressively recruit children by tricking the parents into giving them their children, promising them an education, which never materialises because the orphanage is basically a profit-making enterprise and they're not providing an education. Instead, they are then putting out messages on Facebook saying, please help our poor, starving Haitian orphans, please come and volunteer. And we found at least $100 million a year going into those orphanages in Haiti. That would put 770,000 children through school.
Goodness
so
gracious.
that means that a huge amount of that money is going into people's pockets rather than going to actually support and help the children.
Can I ask
just one final point on that? One final point is that we managed to bring many of those children home to their families with the tiniest bit of support, a fraction of the amount of money that is going into the orphanages.
Shannon, if you're advising somebody, okay, and let's say my children were thinking, they're old enough to do their own thing now, but I mean, if they were thinking of doing something like this, how could I spot the rogue organisations that are trying to rip me off at the expense of those children, let's say in an orphanage here? Should I just simply avoid orphanages, or is that not the only place where there are problems? How do I spot the bad apples?
Yeah, so best practices now is avoiding orphanages, but there's problems within conservation, there's problems within every sort of sector, construction, everything that you could be doing, there are some problems. So if you were trying to sort of spot the organizations, I would say for a lot of volunteers, my first step is, unless you're willing to invest a lot of time in research, actually maybe don't volunteer. You had said something earlier about what about the people coming back changed, you know, to their home countries. So my point is if that's the feeling you're after, right, if you want that knowledge, there are actually other ways you can go about it, and you're not going to have to do all of my other recommendations, which is start researching development issues around that, find, you know, research papers and studies and all of these sorts of things. If that's not your bang for like 2 weeks, you're not like, oh, maybe, you know, spending months learning about this issue isn't really what I wanted. What I wanted was an experience. I say, well, go spend your travel dollars on social enterprises or find a local organization addressing the issue you cared about. Have an amazing trip and make sure your money is staying in the community, because that's actually going to have a more profound impact.
You know, it's a funny old thing, though, isn't it? I mean, what you're doing is you're suggesting that people pick up on the local experience, and Teddy, you were nodding in agreement there, whereas in fact you would think that's counterintuitive, that it's much more likely that you're going to get advice from what looks like a pucker company with a website with certain recommendations, rather than going to the outskirts of Kampala and finding somebody who's recommended by the bloke you met in the market.
So
sorry, Shannon, it's Teddy this time.
No, I think it's very true. I think a lot of people are not, they don't necessarily get into this for the learning perspective, but more for the feeling that they're doing good in the world, for the feeling that they're solving something that they don't actually think that can actually be solved in a 2-week trip, in a 1-month trip, or even a year trip. But they just want to improve on themselves. And I think Shannon pointed out to an issue that I also have, is like this travel benefits most of the time the traveler, not the local person that is there. And that's where the imbalance is for me.
Is this what's been described, I think his name's Teju Cole, he's a novelist, as the white saviour industrial complex, a big emotional experience that validates privilege?
I think that's absolutely what it is. I think it's very sad, because I don't think that the individual has that intention, but that is the industry that they're buying into. One of the other negative outcomes actually can be for the volunteer themselves. We have been in contact with many, or rather many ex-volunteers have contacted us asking for help, because they have witnessed children being beaten to death in orphanages. They have had children disclosed to them horrendous abuse, and they don't know what to do about it, because they're 18, 19 years old and they are not skilled social workers, and they don't know how to intervene, and in fact they can't. We tell them to get out of there, because they're not in a circumstance where they know whether or not it's safe to tell the local authorities, or whether it's safe to tell, you know, to tell the police. We do tell them that if you can find a good local NGO that works on children's rights issues, go and talk to them and ask their advice. But for most of them, really, it's get out, because you are not safe and you can't save those children. And it's such a traumatizing experience for the volunteer, and particularly then the volunteers who do find out that they were exploited as well, and that the children who came into the orphanage had families and wanted to go home, and their families wanted them, and they were simply there to provide the volunteering experience.
Tom, I don't imagine that they're the extremes of danger that Georgette's just referred to in the work you do in the animal kingdom. But what are the real difficulties, and how could you avoid them if you wanted? If you were passionate about wildlife conservation and wanted to help, how can you avoid these pitfalls?
So I mean, just to go back slightly in terms of what one of our guests said, that it tends to benefit the traveller more so than the local community, and I think that's owing to the complexity of voluntourism. If you take it in a marine conservation sector, the benefit, of course, is there to the volunteer. They go through qualifications, training, it's that whole personal development. But then if you take it into the bigger picture, the data that we collect goes into the community. It helps to create marine protected areas. It helps to create bylaws for the prosperity of future generations within that community. And these skills are required, you know, they're required through vocational training, and sometimes they are not accessible to the wider populace.
One sec, Teddy. Just let,
so our volunteers go through that training, but then you have to ensure that capacity building in there as well. So we work to effectively hopefully make ourselves redundant in that community because we build that capacity. But whether to avoid those downfalls, I think the onus is on the volunteer to do that research on the organisation. And I think there is a trend now with social media and having everything at our fingertips is that decisions are made quicker. Oh, that's a nice picture, I'll go with those, without doing that sort of deep research into the organisation to find out what standards are they adhering to, are they tested for those standards, what organisations are they part of, you know, who is making sure that they stay on that straight line and are providing the health and safety, the risk side of things, but also
Shannon, I'm going to go to Teddy first, then come back to you, because I know you want to say something, and it's great that you all want to keep talking. Teddy.
Yeah, my question was, I mean, in terms of the volunteers who are coming to collect the data, what is wrong with the people who are there locally? Why can't they be trained? Because you're taking this time to train individuals who are coming in to do volunteering. Why can't you actually apply that training to local members of the community who can actually do the work, and so you can kill two birds with one stone.
Is it perhaps, Tom, that the locals don't want to do it, and
No,
the volunteers are willing to give you money, and they want to do it?
Yeah, so it's a bit of both. So we have to look at the bigger picture here in terms of conservation. Funding is very limited for conservation, and we have to explore different routes. And this citizen science approach, or the funding through volunteers, it's a wide applied approach, and it's been around for a while. But yes, local stakeholders can be trained, and that's what we are doing. You know, we take scholars, local Filipinos every month. We train them in the exact same capacity as an international volunteer, shall we say. So we're building that capacity within the country. But then we also, we employ local staff as well. One of our local staffs, he started as a security guard. He's now recently left, and he's the lead scuba instructor and a local dive shop in the Philippines. He was one of our most experienced members on site, and he was a local person from the local community that had been trained up. So yes, we could, you know, there is that drive to train local people because it is a necessity, and we understand that in the conservation sector. If you don't do that, you don't build your trust, and then your actions are met with stone walls, essentially. So you have to integrate it in there, but we have to be pragmatic in this sense. We have to look at the funding side of things.
Shannon, let me throw this one at you and then back to Georgette. When I was leaving school, I looked into what was known as VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas. Nobody told me it was a bad thing. Was it bad then, as bad as it is now, or has something changed?
Okay, so I refuse to sort of put my ethics out there for other people. What I think is everybody has to have their own sort of ethical compass on this, and that is within volunteering as well. So if you don't have enough information to vet that organization, then perhaps you need to do more research. But in general, my sort of litmus test for any volunteer organization is, are they willing to tell you no? If I go to them and say, I want to insert any sort of volunteer experience, I want to go, you know, do veterinary services in a jungle somewhere in Africa, I want to go to an orphanage, will they tell me I'm not qualified? And if they won't, then there's a real problem.
Okay, so if they're too eager, then you need to be a bit suspicious. But what has changed, if anything, Georgette?
In terms
of the attitude, I mean, was I about to be ripped off if I'd done VSO, or would the locals have been ripped off by my presence, or has something changed?
I think it's difficult to say. I don't know. I think that what has changed is volume. And what has changed is the ease of travel. And because of that, I think that there are a huge number who perhaps go for short periods of time. So with VSO, if I remember correctly, you got training initially and you went and you were engaged for quite a long period of time.
It was up to
and
6
you had
months.
somebody who supervised you. And so perhaps that was, I'm not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but certainly it was a lot more careful than someone who just, as part of a safari to Kenya, for example, goes and volunteers for after they've gone to see the elephants and the giraffes, goes to volunteers for one day in an orphanage.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. We sort of combine the human element with the animal element in more ways than one, because I think, Teddy, that dog outside needs some biscuits. Good luck. Thank you very much indeed with everything you're doing in Kampala. Thank you, Shannon. To you and to you, thank you, and thank you for watching. You've been watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. We hope to have your company next time. Bye-bye.